Hello, BookTube. I wanted to do a video on the first book in the Heinlein 2025 project. Um, this is a project to read a list of books by Robert A. Heinlein, and it started with Red Planet, and I read it in this science fiction book club omnibus. It's one of several volumes. You can't really see them on my background here because they're right over there. So in this volume, we have Rocket Ship Galileo, Space Cadet, Red Planet, the one we're going to discuss, and Farmer in the Sky. Now, I want to be right up front here. There's going to be spoilers. There's no way for me to talk about this in a meaningful way without spoilers. I could just tell you I liked the novel, and I did. And that generally this was what it was about, and we'd leave it at that. But I'd like to do a little more. So if you haven't read it and are going to read it, you probably need to skip this video until you're done reading the book. Or maybe spoilers don't bother you. It's not they don't bother everybody. So this book is Robert A. Heinlein, edited by Virginia Heinlein, Grumbles from the Grave. And it gives a background to a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff with Heinlein's publishing. Here you'll see the section where they talk about Red Planet. You have Virginia Heinlein's his wife. You have Lurton Blassingame, who's Heinlein's agent. That's who a lot of these letters are to. And in this case, you have, let me see if they show her, Miss Dalgleish from Scribner's. She's actually the publisher who handled Wind in the Willows. Let me see if I have her full name. They had a problem with the Alice Dalgleish. So Heinlein has a contract to provide juveniles. These are books for boys. They're specifically marketed. And censorship at the time was pretty heavy. And at Scribner's, they actually had a librarian, what we would call a youth librarian today, at least in my neck of the woods, who would read and censor, and almost like a modern sensitivity reader. It's censorship. And to go to the market, and for Scribner's to get the books into libraries and reviewed in places as an appropriate book for children, they used these librarians who tended to be back then elderly ladies, women. And this caused some tension. And so part of the tension is because Heinlein's political views, I think we would probably categorize him today as a libertarian. Not a populist Republican or a conservative Republican or a leftist Democrat or a centrist Democrat. He would probably fit into that category of a libertarian, but he hated categories. He didn't want to be put in a bucket. But I'm just trying to give you a general idea of where nowadays we might think, at least for much of his ideas. But like anybody, he didn't have a systematic philosophy. He had a range of views, and they come through in these letters, because in these letters he's having quite a conflict with the editor. So what is the book about? And I'll just read you a little bit out of this brief description. Red Planet was from 1949. As a juvenile with Scribner's. Jim Marlowe, a teenage Martian colonist, takes his pet Willis, a Martian bouncer, away to school with him. The headmaster impounds Willis, since pets are not allowed at school. Jim rescues the bouncer, and he and his friend Frank run away from the school, taking Willis with them. After a wild cross-country trek, which includes a visit to a Martian building, the three are able to thwart a plot to prevent the colonists from making their annual migration. Thanks to Willis's ability to record exactly voices and words that he heard, the colonists revolt against the plan, not wishing to live through an extremely cold Martian winter in high latitudes. And that's it. That's really a good little thumbnail. And you can see a picture of the original cover. So my edition I read doesn't even have cover art. There is a part where Heinlein suggests an artist that had done some work for some of the science fiction magazines, and the Scribner's editor was having nothing to do with it. She thought it comes through pretty clearly that she thought that was cheap literature and cheap art, so she turned it down, which also infuriated Heinlein. So what were the problems? So you have these two boys, Jim and Frank, and you have the bouncer, a little ball-shaped Martian. There are other Martians who are creatures of more structure, not just little round balls. And then there's partially abandoned Martian cities. There's canals, which is the old idea about Mars, that they had canals. And when the winter season hits, they're frozen solid, and you can't really live outside. So the Martians move back and forth, different directions for the weather, not for the weather, but for the seasons. And there's something called the company, which in Heinlein's mind is bureaucracy. He's not a big fan of huge corporations, and he's not a big fan of the government that's back on Earth. And he is very much into independence. So Jim and Frank are going to go to school, which is part of their contract with the colonists, because they live under pretty harsh conditions, and they have to have, there's rewards built into the system, is that the education for the children is paid for. But there's only one school, and it's in a central location, but it does cause hardship. So Jim, whose best friend is Willis, one of them, Frank also, the bouncer, the Martian, Jim says he's going to take him with him, and Frank says, I don't think you can do that. But Jim doesn't see Willis as a pet. He sees Willis as a friend. And Willis is the same way. Like the description said, Willis can mimic in great detail, even the voice, the tone, everything. He's just like a recorder. And once he starts going, it can be embarrassing, if you said the wrong thing in the private conversation, So, and they've all learned this. So, Frank and Willis and Jim head off to school. Our beloved headmaster is just retiring and leaving. The boys are sort of disappointed they didn't get to be there under him. And the new headmaster is a family member of the director of the company. The company is got pretty rough plans for the colonists. They look down on the colonists. And all of a sudden, bureaucracy, all these rules come into play. Now, one thing Alice Dalgleish did not like was the guns. And early on, and Mr. Heinlein was a right to bear arms type of guy. He thought they don't want to take your guns for a reason, and that was his opinion. And he thought the same thing about Mrs. Dalgleish, the editor at Scribner's. But she insisted that there was too much with the guns. And she insisted on a licensing, that at least that be put in there. And it was sort of a compromise that probably neither side was comfortable with or thought went far enough. So in the story, Jim is licensed to carry a weapon. They all carry weapons because they're like handguns, maybe ray guns, that type of thing. It's never quite clear. Because they actually have predators outside Martian landscapes. And it was by shooting one of these predators and saving Willis that Jim and Willis, the bouncer, became such friends. So they get to school. The headmaster is a tyrant. He's very unlikable, which you always want your villain to be very unlikable. Eventually tries to confiscate the boys' guns. They get around it by hiding them with a friend. And then he confiscates Willis and treats Willis as a thing. And at one point, we find out he thinks he can make money by sending Willis to a zoo. And that makes some Martians mad. So the boys decide to escape school. They end up with a fantastic escape across the planet. Of course, they've got to avoid the cold, the creatures in the desert, and they end up encountering the old Martians. And there's a lot, I don't want to give it totally away, but there's a lot of interactions. Now, you'll see scenes where this book's written in 1949. It's a mom tends to cook, dad goes to work, little sister gets told she can't do the things the boys do. Now, this is a very subversive book. Heinlein's a very subversive writer, and you'll see some of those things turned on your head. You'll think, oh, this is so 1950 or whatever. No. Some of it is, but some of it's subversive. He knows what he's about. So when the boys escape with Willis, they hear a recording where Willis is mimicking a conversation between the headmaster and I think a guy who's a head of security or a general or somebody with the company that's in charge of that stuff. And the plans are not to let the colonists migrate and make them live through the winter in extreme hardship and save the money. And eventually, the boys need to get home to tell everybody. That's half the adventure. And the other part of that first half of the adventure is their interactions with the Martians. And in the old city of Mars. And eventually it's that old city in an underground system of transportation and high-tech things that are a little shocking to the boys that get them home. They do get out the warning. And then the father and Jim's father and Frank's father lead a town meeting of the colonists. Jim's father's in charge, but he's a very conventional man. And then there's the Doc, who the boys have always been friends with, who's very much, I think, a stand-in for Heinlein, a very libertarian guy, egging the boys on and wanting the boys to be involved. And, of course, the father just shoo-shoos them, leads an exodus. They're going to leave anyway, whether the company says yes or no, and they're not really prepared. They get to the school, use it as a fortress, don't even place guards. The father's a little inept. The company's brutal. First, a couple march out because, they decide they're going to go back to the company, and then they're just shot when they go outside the building. Then another couple leave, but they follow the rules and have a white flag instead. The minute the guy stands out, he's killed by the company. It's actually an automated weapon they just set up to fire anytime anybody came out. And the wife and child get back inside. But so the brutality's there. And eventually Doc and the boys and the father first leads a thing where they figure out where this gun's automated at and they find a way around it. They go off. They're still a little inept. Doc leads the boys in an attack on the center of the town. And they take over the town, basically. There were some awkward moments during the book when Willis, who's Jim and Frank always treat as a boy, is sleeping and lays eggs. I guess this caused the Scribner editor some problems, too. I don't know. A Freudian problem, I guess. I have no idea. And this is subversive because really Willis is who keeps rescuing them. And Willis is a girl. This is Heinlein's way of saying, hey, the really, the one who really knows what they're doing is this bouncing thing that you guys keep ignoring. And then the Martians. Because Willis is tremendously important to the Martians. Because Willis is the next generation. Willis is a Martian. And that's sort of the big reveal, right? And the Martians find out about the zoo idea, and they react with violence. Not physical out-and-out violence, but they have power. And then they decide they're just going to get all the Earthlings off the planet. We find out that they had technology and had been visiting Earth before human beings were doing anything. They just went a different path, but they're quite capable. So now you have the other subversive part. And this is, in this case, on every level, morally and technology and social system, everything, the Martians are way superior. And they make the humans look bad. Finally, they're able to convince the Martians that at least the colonists should stay, and they kick off the company and do in a couple of the bad guys. But you're left at the end, or at least I was, wondering, even though they're being allowed to say, human nature is human nature. And I think Heinlein leaves you wondering a little bit, how long before the humans, really, even the colonists, get kicked off? Because there's going to be bad ones. And no matter what you do, that's the way it is with human beings, right? So I left with the feeling that Heinlein's not saying there's a whole lot of hope here. The Martians aren't going to be happy. Eventually, one of those colonists is going to be the bad guy. It doesn't take just the company or just Earth. And human nature is going to show through, and it's not going to go over well, I don't think. So that was, to me, it was a very subversive book. I found some of the controversy with Alice Dalgleish, the editor at Scribner's, to be sort of humorous. I found it sort of sad and disturbing that librarians were the censors. I am a librarian. I hate the thought, but it is what it is. And it's funny that the two things, guns, okay, it's an adventure story, and there's predators, there's going to be guns, and it's a sort of a, I don't know, and it seems funny in 1950 that it would have been such a big deal. And then the sex part, the Freudian thing with the eggs, I'd still have trouble wrapping my head around what was a big deal there. Heinlein's saying basically this is an alien, but it's a female. And your view of females is somewhat limited. And it just doesn't seem like it's worthy of a controversy. But maybe if I was in 1950, I'm old, but I'm not that old, maybe then I would have understood more. But it's a juvenile, fast-paced, a lot of good ideas, descriptions of the landscape. There's a scene where they see the boys and Willis seek shelter under a desert plant that's wonderfully told. The Martian cities are really neat. The abilities of the Martians are really cool. You'll have to read it to know what all those are. But I don't do stars, and I don't do all that stuff, rating systems. A lot of people do, and more power to them. I listen to them. But I don't do them because I change my mind the next day, so it'd be worthless. All I can say is I really loved the book. I really, really loved the book. I thought it was wonderfully written, fast-paced. The language is from the 1940s and 50s. So you're going to have the boys make comments. I mean, there was even a point where the editor wasn't happy because Heinlein used the word yeah instead of yet. I mean, he was using slang. And some of the slang we still use, and some we don't. So some of the stuff we don't sounds a little jarring, but you get over it. And once the pace picks up after the getting to the school is when it really picks up. Then it's not really an issue. So I really liked it. I loved the character of Willis, the bouncer. Jim and Frank were good. The doc, the guy I think of as sort of a stand-in for Heinlein. Even in the end, he would never take leadership. And I think Heinlein saw that as a flaw. And so, it was a book that was a juvenile, but had some depth to it, and I hope you would enjoy it, and I very much enjoyed it, so it was a good first read. Next week, I think this coming Saturday, but those of us who've read it together and have a Voxer group, we're going to be on Sean D. Standfast's channel, having a group discussion about this, so happy reading, I hope you're all well, and thank you, BookTube.